I'm going to try and talk today about something I'm now involved in. So, as usual in my talks, I try to talk from my own practice experience. And if you just tell me what I need to point this at to get it to work, that... Yeah, I'm trying. Okay, harder. I want to particularly acknowledge the Turrbal people and recognise the wonderful welcome to country that we had this morning, but also take the opportunity to acknowledge Indigenous peoples elsewhere in Australia, both within the mainland, Tasmania and the Torres Strait, and Indigenous peoples all over the world. We know that in our sector in particular, it is these people who are particularly disadvantaged and disproportionately represented. So I think we have a special responsibility to acknowledge that rather than just doing it really quickly as a sort of standard statement at the beginning. I also want to thank the organisers of the Winter School, and I'll mention that again. And just to warn you that this is not especially analytic or reflective, it's really a description of some of the processes in a faraway country, if you like, what seems like a faraway world, which is the United Nations drug policy arena. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about that context and the drug policy at that level. The UN drug conventions, I'll just name them and signal that Australia is a signatory to these. The Commission on Narcotic Drugs, CND meetings, that's the Commission's meetings, and its relationship to the UN General Assembly, which generally meets in New York. And then some comments and some description of the efforts of civil society, or NGOs, over the past 10 to 15 years. The membership and role of a relatively newly created civil society task force, of which I'm a member, and then talk about opportunities for the NGOs to share their views and experience. So the UN drug policy, as you will all know in your bones, or you have heard, or you have studied, really is driven by three major conventions, and those are the conventions which basically outline which drugs will be scheduled as what we call generally illicit drugs, and what's to be done about them. I'm just giving you a global kind of description rather than spending time on them. And Australia as a signatory has, in that sense, as most other countries around the world, signed up to those over the decades since their development, and therefore has, if you like, a UN obligation to fulfil the requirements that underpin those conventions. The CND, or Commission on Narcotic Drugs, holds an annual meeting, and that's held in Vienna, which is where the CND Secretariat sits, and that is supported by the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, from which Igor is and works with and spoke to us as the keynote opening speaker. All the governments of the world have an opportunity, and some, those who have been elected as members, to sit in what turn out to be the front. Well, now the way it's arranged, it's generally the front 15 or so rows in these meetings, have government representatives, and those are usually a mixture of law enforcement and regulatory government representatives, so Attorney Generals, Customs, interdiction specialists, police, and for some countries that's all they have, and for other countries they are joined by health. Australia is a little bit unusual. There are other countries that do also have health, or the Department of Health, or the Health Minister leading this delegation. So I just want you to at first know that this is not necessarily seen across the world as a largely or predominantly or primarily health issue. Many member states and many countries still see this as a law enforcement and crime issue. I've had the useful and interesting opportunity to serve as a technical advisor on the Australian government delegation probably about 9 or 10 times over the last 15 years, and that's been very useful background for my current role as now representing NGOs or civil society in any discussions that are held. The International Narcotics Control Board is, if you like, I think of it as the sort of policing arm of the CND and the operation of the conventions, and their role, in my words, is to check out and see how countries are managing their compliance with the conventions, to draw attention in their reports to what's actually happening in the world, and to draw attention, if necessary, where countries or member states are seen to be doing other than complying with those conventions. We actually have amongst us Wayne Hall, who's down here, Professor Wayne Hall, friend and colleague, who has been a member of the International Narcotics Control Board for 2 years until late last year when he retired, and he was a WHO representative, so not Australian as such. So WHO elected him and appointed him, and subsequently, in fact, one of his colleagues, Richard Mattick from NDARC, is now sitting on the INCB. So we've actually had strong representation in that sense. Prior to Wayne, the then recently retired chair of the ANCD, the Australian National Council on Drugs, Mr. Brian Waters, a Salvation Army officer, was a member of the International Narcotics Control Board. He was there as a government-nominated member, not as a WHO member. So just sort of signalling some of the nature and composition of these bodies is often a mix of an attempt to get expert experience onto them and sometimes government appointees. So all of the committees, in my experience, associated with the United Nations are highly political beasts, even if they are predominantly there as experts. The UNODC I've already mentioned, and that's a very important office for us to be aware of and to relate to, because among other things, they actually have a lot of most useful guidelines and documents that they put out for countries around the world to develop treatment, to develop prevention programs, a whole range of material that is accumulated there that we in Australia, I think, rarely access, and most of us are probably not aware of. But you might find it useful because they do make an attempt to make or ensure that that is evidence-driven, and it is far less political than many of the other documents or experiences and processes of the United Nations. So I do commend to you the UN Office of Drugs and Crime website and the range of guidelines there. I'm sure Igor could give us more information if you're interested to follow up on. Importantly in the drug space are a number of other conventions that are not specifically drug conventions. So these include things like human rights conventions, the rights of the child, Indigenous peoples forums, etc. And there are many different ones which cut across or have very significant impacts on the drug conventions. Clearly something like the death penalty associated with drug trafficking or drug use, as it is in some countries, is one of those things that is voiced in the human rights arena, and so it's just a little obvious example in Australia's more recent, I suppose, forays into this space. So that's just a brief introduction to some of the drug policy and mechanisms, or what they call instruments, that is the bodies or the things that make the UN policies work or attempt to implement them. In 2009, the United Nations General Assembly, which sits above all of the other bits and pieces, including the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, at a special meeting, established that by 2019, so that was 10 years later, they set a target date and set a global aim or goal to eliminate or reduce significantly and measurably all of the following things. I'm not going to read them all out, I'm just going to go for the highlighted words. So they focused on cultivation, of what are regarded as the crops that are associated with illicit products, reducing significantly demand for these drugs, reducing significantly production, manufacture, marketing and distribution of these drugs, and reducing the diversion of and illicit trafficking in precursors, but also in the drugs themselves. And I haven't got all of the words of this resolution here, but it included money laundering related to illicit drugs. So this was set as a 10-year target, and countries had to try and develop, I guess, a version of their own KPIs to see how they would measure these, what would be the indicators of success, and how would all of this run. I was actually at the CND meeting prior to the 2009 meeting, and there were efforts there to, from some countries, to have radically different ideas. They didn't get up. Some of the documentation of that particular CND meeting is actually quite interesting because there are a number of countries, I forget exactly how many, I think about 30, who wanted to include an alternative and additional statement at the end, which is actually quite unusual, since one of the critical process measures or rules of the UN is that decisions will be made by consensus. Now, I was just talking down here before we started on how complex it is to get any group, be it our own family, our own services and all the staff, our local government, our state government, or let's look at our national government for what it's worth. I did in fact mean to bring up my blue handbag to show that although I've got a red scarf on, I have got a blue handbag. Because one of my roles is to try very hard to represent the diversity of views, not a particular view or my own view necessarily, though I will say I will try and use my own experience and hopefully some garnered wisdom from others to select and prioritise some of the issues I take forward. So in this environment, it's extremely difficult to get through all the processes required to get a decision with the right words that everyone can vote on and agree upon. So look how difficult it is at our national level to get agreement on, let's pick the current one, tax reform. Can you imagine the whole world having to come to agreement on a set of words that captures something that every government in the world can agree upon? It takes hours. And I once spent 5 hours in a side event discussion I was asked to adjudicate between the USA and Brazil over the use of the word harm in a sentence that the Brazilians had in a resolution, and the US at that time refused to accept the word harm in any UN resolution to do with drugs. So I'm just signalling how tedious this can be and how complex a process it can be. So, as an example of what happens as a result of that language issue, in 2012, the United Nations General Assembly, looking to review this, decided to accept the advice of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs to hold a special session, that is the United Nations General Assembly Special Session, UNGAS, 2016, on world drug problem, towards looking to see how we're all going on that 2019, or how will we all be in the 2020s. And this is a part of the sentence that passed the resolution that a meeting would be held in 2016. It is to review the progress in the implementation of the political declaration and plan of action on international cooperation towards an integrated and balanced strategy to counter the world drug problem, comma, not a full stop, including an assessment of the problem within, and that's my highlighting, within the framework of the 3 international drug control conventions and other relevant United Nations instruments. That's only part of a sentence, and you can see already how complex and convoluted sentences need to be to get the whole world to agree on them. I highlighted the word within because underneath that sits a debate about whether or not they would, or perhaps will, allow a radical consideration of any of those conventions. The word within, I will predict, will undoubtedly be debated for some time at CND in 2016, prior to the special meeting, because some will want to open, as it's called, open the conventions, that is, in a sense, put the conventions to one side and let's say, let's try again and have a new lot. And others will say, no, we already agreed, we would only discuss within the conventions, that is, we will not consider changing the conventions. So I'm just trying to give you some of the nuances, both of language and process, that go on in the United Nations. I think, a bit sadly, we will not get an opportunity to rewrite conventions and bring them together and have some kind of rational, evidence-based new world order. I think it's highly likely that we will be still with the same conventions and the same sorts of instruments or organisations and processes will continue. But it is an opportunity to at least have that discussion. I may be wrong. Perhaps if I could predict the future, it'd be interesting. So where does the non-government voice sit within this rather complex, often tedious, laborious environment? Well, firstly, the words are important, and hopefully I've already shown you that just by highlighting that one part sentence. And one of the important sets of words that we are only starting to hear used in Australia is the notion of civil society. So we have usually talked about that as non-government organisations or non-government institutions. So it's really the equivalent for us of NGOs. Another phrase that is very commonly used in the UN and is starting to be used a little bit in politics here is the phrase fit for purpose. Really meaning, does what we've got now work satisfactorily, adequately, work well, given that what we're trying to achieve? So an example in our realm would be, is it helpful to have cannabis scheduled as an illicit drug along with a whole range of others, or is it not? But that's not a debate we're likely to have. But the notion of being fit for purpose is something that sits behind, a little bit behind, trying to increase the voice of NGOs in the UN environment. Because one of the things is that while governments have the right, and each government is a sovereign government and has an opportunity to make decisions for their own country, many of the officers that represent those governments are not necessarily knowledgeable over time or specifics about some of the issues that they discuss. I was in one of the split sessions earlier on when, I think it was Cameron from Dovetail, mentioned saffron oil, and I started to imagine, would we have a UN resolution coming up in the next few years about aniseed oil? Because I can very clearly remember when saffron was being debated about whether it should be included in the illicit products under the conventions. Now, you will probably all be thinking, what on earth is that? So this is in the environment of precursors or things that are used to produce some of the illicit substances that are named under the conventions. And you'll know in Australia that I don't know what the number is now, but we've got more than 400 different chemical combinations that are declared under our various laws associated with what's illegal to, in some places or mostly, to possess, to use, to traffic in, to sell, etc., to manufacture. Keeping up with the changes in the chemical compounds that can produce psychoactive effects that we enjoy and we like as human beings with brains that respond to these things is a major challenge for governments all around the world. And so we get this notion, I think, of fit for purpose and having to think about whether the conventions and all the bits and pieces that were written over that period of time still work in our current environment. And in our current tax environment, it does seem to me from all the discussion, everyone is agreeing that our current taxation arrangements are not especially fit for purpose, but no one can agree on what we should do differently. And so we may or may not see, I suspect not, any specific or very helpful changes, and this is very similar to the UN environment. That is, things can be shown to be not especially fit for purpose, but efforts to change it cause so many ripple effects and such division and difference that in the end everybody ends up in the consensus environment of going for what they've currently got, with tweaking a bit here and there. So over these last 10 or 15 years, thanks particularly to a group led at the time by a Canadian chap called Michel Perron, the civil society groups or NGOs going along to this Commission on Narcotic Drugs meetings and to other forums have gradually, I think, increased the respect that governments and the UNODC and then CND have for the voice of civil society, recognising that civil society also often includes researchers and people who've had long experience in the drug arena that can be handy. This has meant that at CND meetings, we've now been able to slowly often have a representative voice. And there are some different ways that NGOs can be involved, either through big international NGOs who have natural membership as observers, but not speakers, so things like the Red Cross, for example, but also the Seroptimists Association and other more obscure ones. Through the people who've been engaged in research and policy debates, and then by engagement with WHO, and as I mentioned, the UNODC and their documents and input into those. And through membership of linked bodies. So there is a Vienna non-government organisation committee on drugs, which organisations that are national bodies here in Australia can be members of. The Australian Drug Foundation, for example, is attempting to become a member. I think Drug Free Australia is a member, and so on. There are a number of organisations who are members. And so the Civil Society Task Force was created last year. This is the task force that I have been appointed to as an Australian representative. I was appointed by the Vienna Committee together with the New York Committee, NGO Committee on Drugs, to represent Australia, together with Ross Bell from New Zealand, to represent this region, including Pacific nations. My role is to try and hear from you, from NGOs, and to bring forward the possibility of NGO voice to have our issues aired in the United Nations environment. The expectations of the Civil Society Task Force, which members 27 people representing the range of regions of the world, together with what are called affected groups, so that includes farmers of illegal, or supposedly illegal products, depending on where they are, and people who use drugs, people who inject their drugs, those affected groups, family, people who are representing families who've been affected by drugs, and then all the regional reps. The expectations is not that we will form consensus, because we know we have diverse opinions and experience. We are having to operate through teleconference, Skype meetings, emails. I went to the first meeting in Vienna in February, March this year. I will go to the next one, which will be at the same time, and that's critical because that's the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which will basically feed into the General Assembly meeting. After I was appointed and invited to go to the first meeting with short notice and booked my flight and all my accommodation and so on, I did get an email explaining that the Vienna NGO Committee has very little funds, and what they do have, they think, should go to third world country representatives, which I agree with. So I am self-funded, both for that sort of attendance and those airfares and accommodation, and for that matter coming to Brisbane. So I do especially appreciate the free registration to the organisers of this event. The purpose is for us to express our views, issues, ideas and experience and try and have those listened to. And there is a resolution that includes us at CND, which includes those words, to include the voices of civil society organisations through the Civil Society Task Force, which does mean that that Civil Society Task Force is likely to be allowed to speak briefly, and it'll probably be one or at most two of the 27 members who will get to say something in those meetings. I'm here today really to seek your input, having given you that background, and to ensure as far as possible that there is some voice from NGOs. I've already emailed, and hopefully many of you have already been exposed to, a global drug survey, not Adam Winstock's one. This is one being run out of the Vienna office, seeking the input from NGOs. If you struggle to get that website web address, because it ends at the end of this month, so if you haven't done it and you want to, try and do it quickly. If you can't answer all questions, then answer the ones you can, because I've urged them to take on board answers to any question, not dump all those responses that haven't answered every question. But end of July for that. And then there are consultations available where possible. And for me, this is my simplest and I suppose most efficient way of consulting, to come to meetings like this, to tell you a little bit about the UN and to invite you to find me later today or tomorrow, tell me things or send me emails, which I'll give you at the end. So that's what I'm really here for this time, is seeking input. To get to that website, I think if you put Vienna NGO or VNGO Committee C and just search, you'll find it on their website pretty readily. So if you've not managed to get that, you could still find it. So just to add a little, if you like, frisson of competitiveness, I've asked them to please give us feedback on how many people have responded already, because I was sending out emails, mainly through the network organisations, asking them to send them on to members, with no idea about whether anyone had seen this. So this is the responses in English, and the darker the blue, the more responses. So we're not doing too badly, but I'd just love to beat the US and North America. So I'm urging you to make ours nearly black by just responding to that survey. But not doing too badly. For those of you interested in the responses in Spanish, so one of the things we've had to do is get this survey translated. It's also why some of the questions are very clunky. It's very hard to ask one question to every NGO in the world that will make sense. And so you'll read some and think, I have no idea what that means. And if you don't, leave it. Or imagine what it might mean. And for those of you who are Francophiles, there's the French responses. So just as a bit of feedback along the way, as of the 10th of July, we were looking darkish blue, but not as dark blue as we could, if you'll get on board and have a go at that survey. I think just the other part of our background is that Australia really has been something of a leader in the international drug policy environment, perhaps less so over the last 5 or 6 years, but prior to that, I think we had a reputation from the mid-80s for a good 20 years or so as being a country that really had given a lot of forethought and conceptually worked on this, as well as our research base. We've had a national drug policy since then. We've had COAG agreements with the states and Commonwealth trying to come together through the Ministerial Council on the Drug Strategy when it existed. The Intergovernmental Committee on Drugs, which still exists. And we've had roles of various bodies, and I've put X in front of some because they no longer exist. So ADCA no longer exists. However, what I call the ARDAs, so Ardent, which is the Northern Territory one, QANADA, that you're familiar with here, and the various other ARDAs, so WANADA, VADA, NADA, etc. They have been most important for me and most useful in facilitating that blue Australia to be as blue as it is. There's been the ANCD, which no longer exists, APSAD, NIDAC, the National Indigenous Drug and Alcohol Committee, which is trying to sort of struggle on, though it no longer is funded, and intends to still have their conference. I think it's next year. Now we have the new advisory group, ANACAD, and then a whole lot of specific NGOs. So we actually got a lot of NGO bodies or network bodies in this space. And then there's the international NGO voices. An example of that is the International Union for Cancer Control, and through my presidency of the Cancer Council in Victoria, and the fact that the CEO who was retiring was then going on to be president of that international body, I was able to get him to make one of his top 3 priorities for his presidency the issue of access to opiates, because it's of key concern to the cancer community, for palliative care, and for terminal care so that people don't die in pain. And yet there are still very many countries around the world who cannot get legitimate pharmaceutical opiates. So that was put there because it's a lot easier to argue internationally that cancer sufferers need opiates than it is to say these same countries need to have methadone, buprenorphine and other opiate substitution therapies available. But if they could get the pain relief opiates, it would also be more possible for them to have pharmacotherapies. So just a little example of some of the strategic ways, I suppose, through my experience, I've tried to use my networks to influence international drug policy. There are, of course, a lot of other bodies, the World Health Organisation, the World Trade Organisation. Australia is up before the World Trade Court due to our plain packaging around tobacco at the moment. There are many representatives of police, regulatory authorities and interdiction experts who dominate much of the discussion around drugs internationally, and their focus is especially on crime and on the smuggling, whether it is of drugs, people or guns. And the routes of smuggling and the incentives are very similar for all 3 of those things. There are a lot, though, of strengths in the Australian approach. I'm not going to detail them all. I think we've particularly been good in including licit and illicit drugs in our national drug strategy rather than separating them out particularly. We've had law enforcement and health working together, which might seem sort of old hat to us now to some extent, even at local level or even at national level. But in many countries that is still remarkable and amazing, and they can't believe that police and health people can sit in the same room and discuss drug policy. I was recently challenged by Kay Hull, the now chair of ANACAD, about Australia being very good at talking the talk, but do we still walk the walk? And on bringing all these things together. And I said that's the challenge I would put back to ANACAD. This is just a reminder of the pillars and the way we characterise our approach in Australia. Notwithstanding all of that, these are now somewhat old figures, but this is some work that the Drug Policy Modelling Program at NDARC did, and this is partly where the modelling interest comes, because it was my pushing and ideas about how can we imagine the future so we know what we need that was the impetus for us originally getting the funding for DPMP that Professor Alison Ritter has really taken a lot further and managed to take to NDARC. You'll see that our law enforcement, 42%, interdiction, if we add the 14%, more than half of all our funds definitely go in the law enforcement interdiction arena. Treatment 17%, prevention 23%, 3% for harm reduction. So walk the walk, maybe. Very briefly, some of the emerging themes that have already come through in discussion are these. I'll get you to scan them because I'm going to go on. I apologise to those who perhaps are not able to read. And then from the Northern Territory consultation, which I did pretty much this similar presentation, then invited them to come forward. They came forward and added another set of ideas. That was held in Alice Springs 2 or 3 weeks ago. But in the end, and I'm sorry, this is actually probably a bit hard to read, the agenda for UNGAS next year is already set and it's very concrete, and the debate and discussion will be under these headings. So my challenge as a member of the Civil Society Task Force will be to convert those issues and ideas and experience into this agenda and take forward some of those ideas under these headings: drugs and health, drugs and crime, drugs and human rights, youth, women, children and communities, and cross-cutting issues, so anything else that's not otherwise included, new challenges, threats and realities, and alternative development, and that's especially in the farming environment. So just to sort of signal, my challenge will be to take your experience and ideas and issues you put to me into that framework. So far from the survey that's been done, this is a sort of plot diagram of the issues that are coming forward from you and other people around the world who've already responded. So drugs and health, civil society, human rights, conventions, civil society inclusion, treatment, etc. And to make contact with me, I do have an honorary appointment, so I'm allowed to have an email address at the University of Melbourne, and so I'm just hamilton@unimelb.edu.au, and I really invite you and look forward to receiving lots of emails. If you could put UN or CSTF or something up front, it will help me differentiate then from all the other junk that comes into our email, because otherwise I might miss it. So I do appreciate the opportunity. I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to making Australia really, really dark blue, if not black, on that diagram. Thank you.